They chased her out of town like a stray dog, without explanation, without a shred of pity. They laughed in her face, hurling insults like stones. And Clara Whitmore, carrying an old suitcase, her purse containing only a few coins, walked away without looking back. Not because she didn't hurt, but because she knew tears wouldn't change anything. But action could. Like, subscribe, and comment the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has progressed. And don't leave the screen, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The morning Clara Whitmore left Harding Falls, the sky was the color of a bruise. Not the dramatic kind of bruise, not purple-black and swollen, but the sickly yellow-green that settles in on the third or fourth day, when the injury is trying to heal but hasn't decided yet whether it's going to manage it. That color sat low over the rooftops of the town, pressing down on the grain silos and the church steeple and the rows of storefronts with their painted signs, and Clara thought that it suited Harding Falls just fine. The town had always looked better when it was showing its damage. She carried one suitcase. Brown leather, the brass clasps tarnished to near black. One corner reinforced with a strip of rawhide she'd lashed on herself after the original stitching gave out 2 winters ago. Inside it, 3 dresses, 2 work shirts, a pair of dungarees that had been mended so many times the patches had patches, her mother's wool shawl, a tin of salve, and a small notebook with a broken spine where she'd kept lists of things she meant to do and numbers she needed to remember. She had $11.40 in her coat pocket. She had a letter from a man named Cole Mercer, written in cramped, frustrated handwriting on ranch stationery. Redstone Ranch, Fuller County. Printed at the top in faded ink, offering her the position of ranch cook and general housekeeper at $30 a month, room and board included. She had nothing else. The train station at Harding Falls was small enough that a person standing at one end of the platform could have a comfortable conversation with someone at the other end without raising their voice, which meant that when Dorothy Alcott and her sister Vera arrived to see someone else off and spotted Clara waiting with her suitcase on the far bench, there was no distance to provide privacy. "Well," Dorothy said, loudly enough for the station master to hear from inside his booth, "I suppose she finally got the message." Vera made a sound, half laugh, half something that wanted to be sympathy, but couldn't quite commit. "Don't be unkind." "I'm not being unkind. I'm stating a fact. The Whitmore girl has been a problem in this town since she talked back to Martin Fellers at the Mercantile, and everyone knows it. Some people just aren't suited to living in a community." Clara kept her eyes on the tracks. She had learned, over the past 8 months, that responding to Dorothy Alcott was like throwing a rope into a river. You'd never get it back, and you'd lose something in the process. Dorothy was the wife of the man who owned the largest bank in Harding Falls, which meant that her opinions had a weight they hadn't earned on their own merits. When Dorothy decided a person was trouble, the rest of the town eventually came around to agreeing, the way a creek will eventually find its way downhill. It hadn't taken long after Clara arrived in Harding Falls, fresh off a failed engagement in Ohio, looking for work as a bookkeeper, for Dorothy to decide she was trouble. Clara had made the mistake of correcting an error in the Mercantile's ledger without being asked. The mistake had cost the shop's owner $6 over 4 months, and Clara had seen it in 30 seconds, and she'd said so. Politely, she thought. Directly, which apparently was not the same thing as politely, in Harding Falls. From there it had gone the way these things go in small towns. Word passed. Opinions formed. A widow looking for a bookkeeper decided she'd rather manage her own accounts. The school teacher who'd promised to ask about a teaching position became suddenly hard to find. The women at the Friday market smiled at Clara and moved to the other end of the row. The job at Redstone Ranch had come through Mrs. Paulson at the boarding house, who still treated Clara decently, possibly because Mrs. Paulson was from elsewhere herself, and retained some vestigial understanding of what it felt like. Cole Mercer had written to ask if she knew anyone who could cook and keep house for a working ranch, and Mrs. Paulson had given him Clara's name, and Cole Mercer had written to Clara directly. The letter was blunt, almost to the point of rude. "I need someone who can work, not someone who needs looking after. The hours are long. The men aren't always easy. There's a boy on the property, age 9, needs decent meals and someone to make sure he does his schoolwork. If this suits you, you can start the 3rd week of September. If it doesn't, don't bother writing back." Clara had written back within the hour. The train came in 12 minutes late, which was early by Harding Falls standards. Clara picked up her suitcase, handed her ticket to the conductor, and walked down the platform without looking at Dorothy Alcott or her sister or the station master or anyone else. She found a window seat in the third car, set her suitcase in the overhead rack, and watched the platform slide away as the train pulled out. The town fell behind her, the silos, the steeple, the yellow-green sky. She didn't cry. She wanted to. Maybe there was something tight in her chest that hadn't loosened in months. But the tears didn't come, and she didn't push for them. She just watched the flat land open up outside the window, brown and gold in the September light, the grass moving in long, slow waves, and let herself breathe. Fuller County was 4 hours west by rail, and then another hour by wagon from the Millhaven station, according to the directions Cole Mercer had included in a second, shorter letter after she'd confirmed she was coming. The wagon would be waiting. The driver would be one of the ranch hands, name of Dutch. He won't talk much, Cole had written. Don't take it personally. Dutch was a man of roughly 60, built like a fence post that had been left out in a lot of weather, with a gray mustache that drooped past the corners of his mouth and eyes that assessed Clara in about 4 seconds when she came off the train platform. He took her suitcase without being asked, which she appreciated, and loaded it into the wagon bed without comment. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes." "Dutch Farrow." He climbed up to the driver's seat. "Mercer said to tell you the road's rough in 2 places, but we make it through." "All right." He looked at her for a moment, seemed to decide something, and picked up the reins. "You ever worked a ranch before?" "Not as such. I grew up on a farm." "Different thing." "I know." He seemed to appreciate that she knew. He didn't say anything else until they were a mile out of Millhaven, the wagon rocking on the packed dirt road, the afternoon light going amber and long. Then, without preamble, "The men will test you." Clara looked at the side of his face. "I expect so." "Mercer's a fair man, works hard, expects the same. He won't make it easy on you, but he won't make it harder than it is either. That's all I'm asking." Dutch made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite skepticism. They rode the rest of the way in silence, which Clara found comfortable enough. She'd grown up in a house where silence wasn't hostile, where it was just what happened when people were busy with their own thinking. She looked at the land instead, the wide flat reach of it, the occasional stand of cottonwood along a creek line, the sky that was bigger out here than it had any right to be, clouds stacking up in the southwest in a formation that made her think of something she couldn't name yet. "What's that?" she asked, pointing. Dutch looked. Something shifted in his expression. "Storm building. Been watching it for 3 days." "How bad?" "Can't say yet." He paused. "Harvest season." 2 words. But the way he said them, flat and deliberate, like setting a heavy thing down carefully, told her most of what she needed to know. Yeah. Redstone Ranch announced itself with a gate made of welded iron, the letters R and R worked into the arch above, and a long lane of packed earth leading up to a cluster of buildings. The main house was 2 stories, wood-framed, painted white some years ago, and now faded to the color of old chalk. Behind it, a barn, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, a smokehouse, a chicken yard, fences running in every direction, and beyond the fences, fields. Wheat fields, she realized, the grain standing tall and golden, more of it than she'd expected, rolling away toward the horizon. A lot of wheat that needed cutting before that sky in the southwest got any closer. Cole Mercer was standing at the fence near the barn when Dutch pulled in, talking to a man with a clipboard. He was younger than Clara had expected, somewhere in his mid-30s, tall, with the kind of lean that comes from working rather than from not eating enough, dark hair starting to go gray at the temples, a face that had been left out in the sun and wind long enough to have opinions about it. He looked up when the wagon came through the gate, and he watched them pull in with an expression that was completely neutral, which Clara recognized as the particular neutrality of a man who has learned not to let his face show what he's hoping. He walked over as Dutch brought the wagon to a stop. "Miss Whitmore." Not a question, just confirmation. He looked at her the same way Dutch had at the station, direct, assessing, getting it done. "Cole Mercer." "Mr. Mercer." You have a good trip? Fine, thank you. He nodded once, like that was settled. Dutch will show you the house. Kitchen's yours to run however you see fit. Meals at 6, noon, and 6, more or less, depending on the work. The men eat in the bunkhouse dining room. You'll bring food over or they'll come in. We'll figure that out. Boy's name is Eli. He's around somewhere. He'll find you. All right. Cole looked at her for one more second. Not unkind, but thorough, the way you look at a piece of equipment you're not sure about before you put it to work. I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. My last cook left in July. Before her, the one before that. Both of them said the work was too hard and the men were too rough and the place was too far from town. He wasn't apologizing, just laying out facts. What I need right now, with harvest coming and a storm I don't like the look of, is someone who won't decide in 3 days that this was a mistake and ask me to find them a ride back to Mill Haven. Can you be that person? Clara considered him. She thought about Harding Falls. She thought about Dorothy Alcott's voice on the platform, carrying in the morning air. She thought about the $11.40 in her pocket and the letter with its blunt, honest, unsentimental offer. Yes, she said. He held her gaze for one more moment. All right then. Dutch, take her in. The kitchen was large enough and it had been neglected. That was the most charitable way to put it. The stove needed blacking and one of the burners ran hot on the left side. She figured that out within 10 minutes of lighting it. The larder was reasonably stocked but disorganized. Things shoved in without system, half a sack of flour sitting open with a bag of salt leaning against it. Someone had started to scrub the big cookpot and stopped partway through. There were mouse droppings in the corner behind the bread box. Clara stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, looking at all of it. Then she put on an apron, found a scrub brush, and went to work. She had a passable supper on the table, beef and potato stew, biscuits, dried apple pie that wasn't her best but wasn't her worst. By 6 o'clock. Dutch came in with 3 other men, a tall blonde one who turned out to be called Sven, a shorter, dark-featured man named Ramos, and a young one, couldn't have been more than 20, who someone called Bird without explanation. They filed in without speaking to her, sat down, and looked at the food. Who made this? Bird asked. The new cook, Ramos said. Where's she from? Ask her. Bird looked at Clara, who was at the stove filling the coffee pot. Where are you from? Ohio most recently, she said. Before that, further east. You know how to cook? You're about to find out. Sven laughed at that, a short, unexpected sound like he'd been caught off guard. Ramos smiled into his coffee cup. Bird looked uncertain, like he wasn't sure whether he'd been put in his place or just answered. They ate. They ate well, as a matter of fact, and without complaint, which was the highest form of compliment available in a bunkhouse dining room. Eli found her at 7:30 while she was washing up. She heard him before she saw him. Small footsteps on the back porch. A pause. The sound of someone gathering courage. And then a face appeared in the doorway. 9 years old, she'd been told. But he looked younger than that, still carrying the wide-eyed, uncertain look of a child who hasn't figured out yet whether the world is safe. Brown hair, dirty at the moment, sticking up in the back, a tear in the knee of his trousers. You're the new cook, he said. That's right, Clara Whitmore. I'm Eli. I know, Mr. Mercer mentioned you. He came inside without being invited, which she took as a good sign. A child who waits to be invited into a kitchen isn't hungry enough. He looked at the pot on the stove, then at her, calculating. Is there any pie left? There is. Can I have some? Wash your hands first. He washed his hands at the pump without argument, which suggested someone had taught him right. She cut him a slice and he sat at the kitchen table with it, eating with the focused seriousness that children bring to food they actually want. Where'd you come from? He asked between bites. A town called Harding Falls. Why'd you leave? It was time. He considered that. I came from somewhere else too, he said. My folks died. That's why I'm here. She nodded. She didn't say she was sorry because it was clear from his tone that he'd already processed the sympathy of many adults and found it insufficient, the way children do when the loss is old enough. And Mr. Mercer took you in? He knew my father some.
Said he'd keep me till I was old enough to take care of myself. Eli scraped the last bit of pie off his plate. He's not bad.
He doesn't talk much, but he doesn't yell, and he makes sure I eat. That's more than some people get. Eli looked at her, really looked, the way children do when they're deciding whether you're worth trusting. Whatever he saw apparently satisfied some internal requirement, because he set his fork down and said, "The men are going to give you trouble." I know. Not because they're mean. Well, Bird's a little mean, but mostly it's because the last two cooks didn't work out, so they don't think you will either. I appreciate the warning. You could tell them off, he said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone proposing a tactical option. Mrs. Galloway, that was the cook in the spring, she told Bird off real good one time. He didn't bother her after that for a week. I'll keep that in mind. She refilled his glass of milk without being asked. He seemed startled by this, and then grateful in the slightly embarrassed way of a child who isn't used to being looked after without having to ask. She went back to washing up, and they stayed in comfortable silence for a while, which was a thing she hadn't had much of in recent months, and found she'd missed more than she'd known. Immersive. The next morning she was up at 4:30. She had discovered in her inventory of the larder the previous evening that they were out of lard, low on salt pork, and that the coffee supply, while adequate at the moment, would need replenishing within the week. She'd also found that the bread she'd been baking in her head all evening wasn't going to happen until she dealt with the fact that the yeast in the tin was borderline and might not rise properly. She tested it with warm water and sugar before she did anything else, and waited, watching. It bubbled, but slowly. She'd have to let the dough rise longer than usual. She had biscuits, scrambled eggs, and sliced pan-fried salt pork ready at 6, with a pot of coffee strong enough that Dutch walked past the kitchen window, stopped, and visibly reconsidered his morning. The men came in stages. Ramos first, then Sven, then two others she hadn't met yet, a broad, red-faced man named Hicks and a wiry one called Teague, who moved like he was always in a mild hurry. Bird came last, looked at the table, looked at her, and sat down without comment. Cole came in last of all. He'd been up before she had, she suspected. There was the look of a man who'd already done several hours of work about him, though it wasn't yet 6:30. He poured his own coffee and looked at the spread on the table. "This is good," he said, which coming from him was about equivalent to a standing ovation. "I need to get to Millhaven for supplies by end of week," she said. "Lard, salt pork, more coffee, and I'd like to look at the accounts for the kitchen, if there are any, so I know what I'm working with." He looked at her over his coffee cup. There was something in his expression she couldn't read. Not displeasure, exactly, but a kind of recalibration. "I'll have Dutch take you Saturday," he said. "Accounts are in the study. I'll pull them out tonight." She nodded and went back to the stove. She could feel the men watching her. Not hostilely, but with the particular attention of people who aren't sure yet where a thing fits in the order they're used to. She didn't look back at them. She focused on the eggs, on the coffee, on the particular angle of the morning light coming through the window, and waited for the day to make its demands. They came, the demands. They always did. The first real test came on her third day. She had been watching in her careful, quiet way, and she had noticed that whoever had been managing the supplies before her, no one, apparently, or everyone, which amounts to the same thing, had let the situation drift into a kind of low-grade crisis. There wasn't enough to get through a full week of heavy harvest labor, not if the storm shortened the window and they had to push the men hard. The quantities were wrong. The ratios were wrong. She did the arithmetic twice on a scrap of paper and got the same answer both times. She knocked on the door of Cole's study after supper. He looked up from the papers on his desk. The papers, she noticed, were financial, columns of numbers, a bank letterhead at the top of one page that he moved without thinking to cover with his hand. "Miss Whitmore." "I've been through the kitchen accounts," she said, "and I need to talk to you about the supply situation before we get into full harvest. We've managed before. With fewer men working longer hours in worse conditions, maybe. But I've counted what's in the larder and what I expect the men to need if they're pushing hard for the next 2 weeks, and we're short. Significantly short." He looked at her for a moment. She stood still and let him look. "Show me," he said. She spread her scrap of paper on the desk beside his papers. She'd written it out clearly, what they had, what they needed, the difference, and a rough estimate of what it would cost to close the gap. He studied it. She watched him read, watched the particular stillness that came over his face when he understood what she was telling him. The budget for supplies is already stretched, he said. I know, I can see that from the accounts. I've also worked out 3 places where I can stretch what we have without cutting the men's meals down. But I need you to authorize the additional purchase, and I need to go to Millhaven Thursday instead of Saturday. Thursday's a working day. I know that too. I'll be back by noon. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the wind had picked up. She could hear it in the cottonwoods along the fence line, a low, persistent sound. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "The last cook just managed with what was there and didn't say anything until we ran out of something." "Because running out of something in the middle of a hard push isn't the same as inconvenient," she said. "It's the kind of thing that breaks momentum, and from what I can see, you can't afford to lose momentum right now." Another silence, longer this time. "All right," he said. "Thursday. I'll tell Dutch." She picked up her paper, nodded, and turned to go. "Miss Whitmore." She paused in the doorway. "The accounts," he said. "You read them carefully." "That's what you asked me to do." "I asked you to look at the kitchen accounts." "The kitchen accounts connect to the others." She paused. "I'm sorry if that felt like prying. It wasn't meant to be." He didn't answer right away. She thought for a moment that she'd miscalculated something, gone too direct, too fast, too certain of her own judgment. Then, "No, it's fine. It's useful." He turned back to the papers on his desk. "Thursday, then." The thing about Eli was that he had an eye for people. Clara noticed this slowly, over the first week, the way you notice a quality in a child only when you've seen it enough times to be sure it's a pattern and not just a coincidence. He watched the men without seeming to, at meals, at the water pump, from the fence by the barn. And he processed what he saw with a seriousness that was startling in a 9-year-old. He knew things without being told them. He knew that Ramos got quiet when he was worried and loud when he was feeling good, and that you could tell the difference. He knew that Dutch checked the sky 12 times a day, not because he was anxious, but because he genuinely read weather the way some people read newspapers, and that when Dutch checked the sky and then went immediately to find Mercer, things were about to get complicated. He also watched Clara. He watched her the way he watched the rest of them, with that same unselfconscious attention, and she had the sense that he was keeping a running evaluation, filing observations, updating conclusions, making adjustments. On her 5th day, he came to the kitchen after his lessons and sat at the table and said, without preamble, "Hicks says you won't last the month." "Is that right?" Ramos said maybe 2 months. Sven said he didn't know, but the breakfast was better than anything they'd had since Mrs. Lorne in the spring. "Who's Mrs. Lorne?" "Cook before the last one. She was older and didn't take any trouble from anybody. Bird left her alone." Clara set a cup of warm milk on the table in front of him. "What do you think?" He considered this with the gravity of someone being asked for a professional opinion. "I think you're smarter than the men," he said, "and I think you know how to not make them feel that way. That's harder than being smart." She looked at him. "My mother was like that," he added, a little quieter. He picked up his milk. She didn't say anything. She went back to the stove, and she let the silence be what it was. On the 7th day, Cole told her the truth about the bank. He didn't mean to, she thought, or rather, he meant to tell her just enough to explain why the next 2 weeks were critical, and then the rest of it came out the way things do when you've been carrying them too long and someone asks a direct enough question in a calm enough voice. They were in the study again after supper, going over the supply run totals. Eli was in bed. The wind was doing something uncomfortable outside, and the lamp on the desk threw a warm circle in the dark room. "How much time do we have?" she asked, meaning the harvest, the storm, the arithmetic of it. He looked up from the papers. "What do you know about it?" "I've been watching the sky since I got here. Dutch checks it a dozen times a day, and he doesn't look happy about what he sees. The men are working with an urgency they're not explaining, which means it came from you, and I've looked at the numbers." She paused. "I'm asking how bad it is." He set down his pen. "If we get the harvest in before the storm hits," he said, "I can meet the note at the bank. It'll be close, but I can do it. If we miss, even a few days late, even a partial harvest, I can't." He said it flatly, like reading from a list. Harlan Duff holds the note. He's been after this land since my father's time. He's not flexible. He wants the ranch to fail. He'd be pleased enough if it did. Cole looked at the lamp. I haven't told the men all of it. No point in that, but they know enough to know we can't lose time. And the storm? Moving faster than I'd like. Dutch thinks we've got 2 weeks, maybe less. He paused. I shouldn't be telling you this. Why not? Because you've been here a week, and it's not your problem. She looked at him across the desk. Outside, the wind pushed at the window frame, a low, steady pressure. It's my problem now, she said. I live here. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, not softening exactly, but opening slightly, like a door that's been stuck deciding whether to swing. All right, he said. Then tell me what you need from the kitchen, and I'll make sure you have it. He told her. She listened. She took notes on the back of the supply list, her handwriting small and precise. And when he was done, she went over the numbers with him and found 2 more places to cut costs without cutting the men's food down, and recalculated the margin on the harvest price against the note amount, and asked 3 questions he hadn't thought to ask himself. When she finally stood to go, it was past 10 o'clock. The wind had settled somewhat. The lamp was burning low. You're good with numbers, he said. I trained as a bookkeeper. Then why? He stopped himself. Why am I cooking on a ranch in Fuller County? She picked up her notes. Because it turned out people don't like being corrected by a woman, even when she's right. She said it without bitterness, just factually, the way you describe weather. Good night, Mr. Mercer. Good night, Miss Whitmore. She walked back through the house to the kitchen and stood at the window for a while, looking at the dark fields and the dark sky and the distant pile of clouds on the southwestern horizon that hadn't gotten any smaller since the day she arrived. She thought about the wheat, the timing, the numbers. She thought about Harding Falls and Dorothy Alcott's voice carrying in the morning air and the $11.40 in her coat pocket. Then she thought about Eli saying that's harder than being smart, and the look on his face when he said it, the unself-conscious certainty of someone who had seen enough of people to know what mattered. She went to bed. She would need to be up at 4:30. There was a lot of work to do, and not enough time to do it, and a storm coming that didn't care about any of their plans. She thought, falling asleep, good. That's a problem I can work with. The harvest started on a Monday. Clara knew it before anyone told her, because she woke at 4 as usual and heard the bunkhouse already moving. Boots on floorboards, low voices, the particular sound of men getting themselves ready for work they know will be hard and long and without much mercy. By the time she had the stove lit and the coffee going, Dutch was already in the yard checking the harness on the draft horses, and the sky in the east was barely gray. She made double the usual amount of everything. Eggs, biscuits, salt pork, a pot of oats with dried fruit stirred in that she'd been planning since she counted the men's calorie needs against the expected workday length 3 nights ago. When Hicks came through the door first, he was always first, she'd noticed, some deep habitual punctuality that ran contrary to his gruff exterior. He stopped at the sight of the table. That's a lot of food, he said. You're going to need it, she said. He sat down without argument. She kept the coffee hot all morning, and when the men came in at noon, she had beef stew and cornbread waiting, and when they came in at 6, she had a full supper that would have suited a Sunday table in a prosperous household. She was aware, in a practical way, that feeding men well when they were working hard wasn't generosity. It was mechanics. A tired man fed badly makes mistakes. Mistakes in a wheat field with machinery running cost time, and time was the one thing they didn't have. What she hadn't fully anticipated was how quickly the days would blur together. By the 3rd day of harvest, the ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt less like a schedule and more like a tide. It came in, it went out, and everything that happened inside its movement. The men rose before light. They ate. They worked until they couldn't see clearly. They ate again. They slept. The whole enterprise had a kind of terrible momentum that Clara found herself caught up in without meaning to be. Her own days expanding to fill the available hours, her tasks multiplying in ways she hadn't predicted. On the 4th morning, she found that the water barrel in the bunkhouse had sprung a slow leak overnight, which meant the men had come in from the first 2 hours of work with nothing to drink. She found out because Eli came to tell her, running across the yard with the particular urgency of a child who understands that this is a real problem. She fixed it with a wooden wedge and a strip of canvas soaked in pine tar, a trick her father had shown her on the farm in Pennsylvania when she was 8 years old. It wasn't pretty. It held. She brought water out to the field herself that afternoon, loading the buckets on a handcart, making 2 trips. The men looked at her with expressions ranging from surprise to something less definable when she arrived. Ramos took a ladle and drank and nodded at her. Sven said thank you in his careful, deliberate English. Bird looked at the cart, then at her, and said nothing, which from Bird she was beginning to understand was not hostility, but a kind of reluctant reassessment he wasn't ready to put into words. "Barrel's patched," she told Dutch when he came by for water. "But it needs replacing before winter. I'll tell Mercer. I already wrote it on the supply list." Dutch looked at her over the ladle. A corner of his mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Of course you did," he said. The supply problem she'd flagged in her first week turned out to be worse than she'd originally calculated, because the harvest push meant the men were burning through provisions faster than even her adjusted estimates. She stretched things in ways that required more creativity than she'd expected. A soup stretched with wild onion she found growing along the creek, cornbread made with less meal and more fat to keep the portions adequate, coffee rationed carefully so there was always enough to keep people going without the tin going empty before the next supply run. None of it was elegant. It kept everyone fed and moving, which was the only standard that mattered right now. It was on the 6th evening, while she was scrubbing the big cookpot, and Eli was at the kitchen table attempting arithmetic, that Cole appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, and she looked up from the pot and waited. "We're behind," he said. She put down the scrub brush. "How far?" 2 days, maybe 3. Dutch updated his weather read this afternoon. He came in and sat down at the table across from Eli, who looked up from his arithmetic, then looked back down with the trained discretion of a child who has lived around adult trouble long enough to know when to pretend not to listen. "If the storm tracks the way Dutch thinks it will, we've got 11 days. We need 13. She was quiet for a moment. "What's the bottleneck?" she asked. "Northfield's slower than I planned. The wheat's thicker up there. Good thing in a normal year, it'll bring a better price. But it takes longer to cut, and the team gets tired faster." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I can push the men harder, but I'm already pushing them hard." "Can you hire more hands?" "I've got 1 man I could bring in from Millhaven, maybe 2, but that takes a day to arrange and it costs money I don't have a clean answer for right now." She thought about the kitchen accounts and the ranch accounts she'd seen sitting on his desk the week before, and the letter with Harlan Duff's name at the bottom that she hadn't been meant to see, but had. "What's Duff's position if you come up short?" she asked. Cole's jaw tightened. "Same as it always is. He calls the note due. He's got the legal right to do it if the terms aren't met, and the terms are written tight enough that a partial harvest probably won't satisfy them." He paused. "He came out to the south fence yesterday to have a look at things." "Already?" "He likes to watch. Always has." Cole looked at the table. "My father borrowed from him 20 years ago, when times were bad. Duff's held this land in his mind like a plan ever since. He's patient." Eli had stopped pretending to do his arithmetic. He was watching Cole with an expression Clara recognized, the look of a child absorbing information that is too large for him and storing it carefully for later. "Go finish your sums," Clara said to him, not unkindly. "I'm nearly done," Eli said. "Then go be nearly done in your room." He gathered his papers with the quiet dignity of someone who has been asked to leave a room and is determined not to make it seem like a defeat. At the doorway, he paused. "We're going to make it," he said. Not to either of them in particular, just putting it in the room. Then he went upstairs. Cole looked at the empty doorway. Something in his face that had been tight relaxed slightly, though he probably didn't know it. "He says that a lot," Cole said. "He means it," Claire said. She picked up the scrub brush again. "I've been thinking about the feeding schedule. If I shift the noon meal to be lighter and faster, the men lose less time at midday. I can put more food in the morning, give them something in the field mid-afternoon. I can take it out myself, and make the evening meal heavier. It won't be comfortable, but it'll keep them going and cut maybe 40 minutes a day out of the break time." He looked at her. "That's a significant change." I know. Do you want me to ask them or just do it? Just do it, he said. They'll complain for one day and then they won't. He paused. That's 40 minutes. Multiplied by however many men, for however many days, yes. He was quiet again, doing the arithmetic in his head. Clara watched him think and found herself noting, not for the first time, that he had a quality she associated with people who had grown up with hard problems. He didn't resist them or argue with them. He just started looking for the edges, the places where you could get a grip. It helps, he said finally. It's not enough on its own, but it helps. He stood up. I'll pull a man off fence repair tomorrow and put him on the north field. I'll shift the meals. He nodded and moved toward the door, then stopped. He had a habit of doing that, stopping in doorways, like leaving a room always required one more thing. Miss Whitmore, he said, I want you to know what you're doing here isn't nothing. The men are eating better than they have in a season and a half. Hicks told me this morning that the biscuits alone were worth the new cook. He said it straight, without decoration. I'm not a man who says things like that easily, so I'll just say it once. But I wanted you to know. Clara looked at him. She thought about saying several things and discarded all of them. Thank you, she said. He left. She listened to his boots on the floor, and then the door, and then the yard. She went back to the pot. The next 9 days tested everything. She wouldn't have described it as heroic after, if anyone had asked. It was just work, the kind that asks everything of you and doesn't care whether you have anything left. Her hands cracked from the constant water and scrubbing. She developed a pain in her right shoulder from hauling water barrels and carrying the food cart out to the fields. A deep muscle ache that woke her some mornings before the alarm and didn't leave until she'd been moving for an hour. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose because she was so busy making sure everyone else was fed that she often forgot to eat herself until the day was half gone. But things moved. The harvest moved. The north field, which had looked so immovably slow in the first days, began to give way, row by row, hour by hour, the men cutting and bundling and loading with a persistence that was something to see, something that reminded Clara of water wearing through stone, which doesn't look like it's doing anything impressive until suddenly there's a canyon where there used to be a wall. Eli came to help in the kitchen on his own initiative after the first week, showing up at 5 a.m. one day without being asked, wearing an apron 3 sizes too large and asking what he should do. She put him on potato peeling, which he accepted without complaint, and after that he came every morning. He was slower than he thought he was, and faster than she'd expected. And he had an odd, calming quality that she found useful. He didn't create noise or confusion. He just settled into whatever space he occupied and did what was needed, which was, she had come to understand, the most important skill anyone could bring to a working kitchen. You like this, she said to him one morning, catching him watching her roll biscuit dough with an expression of genuine attention. I like watching things get made, he said, and I like eating them after. Those are good reasons. Cole likes cooking too, Eli said. He doesn't do it much anymore. He used to when I first came. He'd make soup on Sunday nights sometimes. He paused. He stopped after things got hard with the money. Clara filed this away without comment. The moment that changed, something happened on the 10th day of harvest, a Tuesday, around 4 in the afternoon. She was coming back from the north field with the empty food cart when she heard it. A sound from the equipment shed, a metallic crack followed by a string of language from Ramos that she was fairly sure she wasn't meant to hear. She left the cart and went to the shed door. The reaper. The main harvesting machine, the one that did the work of 4 men in half the time. The drive chain had snapped. Not frayed, not wearing thin, but fully, irreparably snapped, one end of it lying on the shed floor like a dead thing. Ramos looked at her from where he was crouched beside it. His face told her everything before he said a word. Do we have a spare? She asked. We had one. Used it last year. He picked up the broken end of the chain. Nearest place to get a replacement is Millhaven. That's a full day, round trip. A full day. She did the arithmetic fast, the way she'd learned to do everything on this ranch. No hesitation, just the numbers, just the truth of them. A full day without the reaper meant they fell further behind. Further behind meant they might not make it before the storm. Might not make it meant Harlan Duff. She looked at the broken chain. Her father had had a machine like this, though older, on the Pennsylvania farm. She'd watched him repair things on it for years, not because she was meant to learn, but because she was curious and he never told her to go away. She thought about a specific afternoon, herself at 12, her father with a piece of iron and a hand forge and a problem that looked unsolvable until it wasn't. "Give me that," she said, and took the chain from Ramos. He let her take it, with the expression of a man who doesn't see what good it's going to do but doesn't have a better idea. She looked at the brake. She looked at the links on either side of it. She looked around the shed, taking inventory. The tools on the wall, the scrap iron in the corner, the small portable forge they used for shoeing horses. "Get Dutch," she said, "and bring me that iron rod from the corner, the thicker one." Ramos looked at her for one long second. Then he got up and went. It took 2 hours. It wasn't the kind of repair that was going to make a machinery man proud. It was improvised, unorthodox, a solution that used what was available rather than what was correct. She burned her left hand once, not badly, and dropped the workpiece twice. And at one point Dutch said quietly from over her shoulder, "That's not how you'd normally—" And she said, "I know, just let me think." And he went quiet and let her think. When she was done, the chain held. She tested it herself, running the machine slowly, watching the links move through the mechanism, looking for stress, for wobble, for any sign that it was going to give. It held. "How long?" Dutch asked. "Long enough," she said. "If someone checks it every morning and doesn't push it past reasonable, it'll get through the harvest. After that, it needs a proper replacement." Dutch looked at the chain, then at her. "Where'd you learn that?" "My father." He nodded slowly. He seemed to want to say something more and couldn't find the shape of it. He settled for, "Good work, Miss Whitmore." Cole found out that evening. Dutch told him, and she heard them talking in the yard when she was in the kitchen, couldn't make out the words, just the cadence of it. Dutch's deliberate voice, Cole's shorter responses, a pause. Then Cole saying something she couldn't hear. He came in later while she was banking the stove for the night. "Dutch told me about the chain," he said. "It'll hold," she said. "It's not permanent, but it'll hold." He looked at her hand where a red welt ran across 2 of her fingers from the forge work. "You burned yourself." "It's fine. You should put something on it." "I have salve. I'll do it before bed." He stood there for a moment, not moving. She got the sense he was working up to something and hadn't quite gotten there. "Harlan Duff is coming Friday," he said. "He wrote to say he wants to inspect the property, which means he wants to count the unharvested fields and calculate how far short we are." He paused. "He's going to try to rattle us." "Will he succeed?" "Not me." Cole met her eyes. "But some of the men, maybe. Duff has a way of making things sound more settled than they are." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the numbers, the harvest rate, the days remaining, the distance between where they were and where they needed to be. The window was slim. It was not, however, closed. "Let him come," she said, "and let me be there when he does." Cole looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Why?" "Because I've met men like Harlan Duff before," she said, "and they rely on the other person believing the thing is already decided." She picked up her dish towel. "It isn't." He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and she had the thought, passing and strange, that he was seeing something in her face that he hadn't expected to find and wasn't sure yet what to do with it. "All right," he said. "Friday." Outside, the wind was moving in from the southwest, steady and unhurried, the way a thing moves when it doesn't have any reason to rush. Harlan Duff arrived on Friday at 10:30 in the morning, which was earlier than Cole had said to expect him, and almost certainly deliberate. He came in a good buggy, black lacquered, with brass fittings that caught the autumn light, driven by a young man in a decent coat who handled the reins with the careful attention of someone who had been told to be careful with the equipment. Duff himself was somewhere past 60, heavy-set but not soft, with a white mustache trimmed to precise edges and the kind of dressed-up-for-business look that was meant to remind you of the distance between his life and yours. He stepped down from the buggy without hurrying, surveyed the yard with the slow, proprietary gaze of a man who has already decided a thing belongs to him and is simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. Cole was at the fence when he arrived. Clara was 20 feet behind Cole, having positioned herself there after breakfast without announcing what she was doing. Dutch was nearby, making himself busy with a harness that didn't need attention. The men were in the fields. She could hear the distant sound of the reaper, steady and mechanical, the repaired chain holding. "Mercer?" Duff said. "Not good morning, not hello, just the name, like a ledger entry." "Duff." Cole's voice was level. Clara had noticed over the past 2 weeks, a remarkable ability to show nothing on his face when he chose to. It served him now. Duff looked at the fields, making a show of it. He shaded his eyes with one hand as if he needed to see better, though she suspected the gesture was mostly theater, a way of making the looking seem authoritative, significant. "Storm's closer than your boys would like," he said. "We're aware." Northfield looked slow. Duff turned back from the horizon. His eyes moved over the yard, the outbuildings, and settled briefly on Clara before moving on. "I've made some calculations." "I'm sure you have." "The way I figure it, even with your current crew working flat out, you're looking at coming up short, not dramatically short." He said this with a particular kind of mildness, the tone of a man delivering bad news he finds satisfying, but short enough that the terms of the note won't be satisfied, which means, "I know what it means," Cole said. Duff nodded, as if they'd agreed on something. He clasped his hands behind his back and walked a few paces along the fence, looking at the equipment, the barn, the house, taking his inventory. Clara watched him do it and felt something tighten in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "Miss Whitmore." He'd come back around to where she was standing, and he was looking at her directly now, with an expression of polite curiosity that had something cold behind it. He'd asked someone her name, she realized. He'd come prepared with that much. "Mr. Duff," she said, "you're the new cook." "I am." "How long have you been at Redstone?" "Going on 3 weeks." He nodded. "Long enough to see what you've walked into, I'd think." He said it pleasantly, with the air of doing her a favor. "Sometimes it's better to know early. Makes other arrangements easier to come by." The yard was very quiet. She could feel Cole go still beside her without looking at him. "I appreciate the concern," Clara said, "but I'm not making other arrangements." Duff regarded her for a moment. "The ranch is going to fall short of harvest, Miss Whitmore. That's not pessimism, it's arithmetic." "I do a lot of arithmetic," she said, "and I've come to a different conclusion." She held his gaze without difficulty. "We have time. Not comfortable time, but time. And the men on this ranch work harder than any crew I've seen." Something shifted in Duff's expression. Not anger, not yet, but the particular recalibration of a man who came in expecting a door to be open and found it latched. He looked at Cole. "You've got until the note date," he said. "Not a day past it." "I know when the date is," Cole said. Duff turned back to his buggy. His young driver was already moving to take his arm. He paused with one foot on the step and looked back at the fields one more time. The long golden roll of wheat that was still standing, still waiting to be cut, still standing between this man and what he wanted. "Good luck to you then," he said, in the tone of a man who did not mean it. He left. The buggy went back down the lane, the brass fittings catching light, growing smaller and then gone. Cole let out a long, slow breath. "That went about as expected," Dutch said, from behind his harness. "Clara," Cole said. He was looking at her with that particular expression she'd come to recognize, the one where he was adjusting something in his understanding of her. "Thank you." She didn't answer right away. She was still watching the lane where the buggy had disappeared, thinking about what Duff had said and how he'd said it, the careful reasonableness of it, the way it was designed not to bully, but to deflate, to make you feel the weight of the thing until you bent under it. "We need to talk about the next 4 days," she said. Cole nodded. Inside. The numbers, when she spread them on the kitchen table with her pencil and the scrap papers she'd been filling up all week, were not comfortable. She didn't try to make them comfortable. She laid them out the way they were: harvest rate per day, estimated days remaining before the storm hit hard enough to matter, the gap between where they'd be and where they needed to be. "If we maintain the current pace," she said, "we come up short by roughly a day and a half of cutting, maybe 2 days." Cole studied the numbers. He'd brought Dutch in and Ramos, who was the most experienced hand and the one the others listened to. They stood around the kitchen table like men at a planning session, which was what this was. "So we push harder," Ramos said. "The men are already at the edge of what's reasonable," Cole said. "Past it, some of them," Dutch added. "Teague pulled something in his back 2 days ago. He's working through it, but he's slower." Clara had already thought about this. She'd been thinking about it since Duff's buggy appeared at the gate, since before that even, since the night she sat with Cole and looked at the harvest projections and felt the gap between want and possible like a physical thing. "There's one more thing we can do," she said. The 3 men looked at her. "I can work the fields." The silence that followed had a specific texture, not dismissal, not laughter, just the complete stillness of 3 men trying to process something their assumptions hadn't left room for. "You're the cook," Ramos said, not unkindly, just as a statement of fact. "I'm also someone who grew up on a farm and spent 4 summers in the hay fields alongside my brothers." She kept her voice even. "I can swing a scythe. I'm not as fast as your men, but I'm faster than no one, which is what you've got right now in the sections between the reaper runs." She looked at Cole. "If I work the manual cutting sections in the afternoons, after the noon meal is set, and before evening prep, that's 3 to 4 hours a day of additional harvest labor. Over 4 days, that closes most of the gap." Cole looked at the table. He was doing something she recognized. Not deciding, exactly, but getting past the part of him that wanted to say no for reasons that had nothing to do with practicality. "It'll be hard," he said finally. "I'm aware of that. The men will say things. They say things now." She paused. "Cole, look at the numbers." He looked at the numbers. She let him look. "All right," he said. Ramos was quiet for a moment, then, "I'll put her in the south section. Wind breaks there. It's easier than the north." "Easier isn't what we need," Clara said. "Put me where you need the help most." Ramos looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, the way he nodded when something was settled. "North section, southwest corner. I'll put Sven close enough to show you the rhythm." "I know the rhythm," she said, "but thank you." She went out the next morning with a scythe she'd borrowed from the equipment shed and sharpened herself the night before, because a dull blade would wear her out 3 times as fast, and she couldn't afford that. She wore her dungarees, the patched ones, the ones she'd brought from Harding Falls, and a flannel work shirt and the worn leather gloves she'd found hanging on a nail in the kitchen and adopted without ceremony. The north field in the morning was cold and bright, the wheat catching the early light in a way that would have been beautiful if she'd had the attention to spare for it. She didn't, particularly. She found her place at the southwest corner, set her feet the way she remembered, and started cutting. The first 20 minutes were the worst. Her back found the unfamiliar demand and voiced its objection at length. Her shoulders ached. The rhythm she'd known at 15, at 18, had to be reconstructed from something more like instinct than memory, found again through repetition rather than recalled clean. She cut badly for a while. She knew it, could feel the inefficiency in every stroke, and she kept cutting anyway. Sven was 30 feet to her left, moving steadily, and he glanced over once and adjusted his own pace slightly, not slowing to help her but coming close enough that she could find the rhythm off his movement if she needed it. She did need it. She didn't acknowledge it, and he didn't make her, and after a while she'd found the thing she was looking for. Bird was the first to say something. He came through her section mid-morning, moving equipment, and saw her cutting and stopped. "You're doing it wrong," he said. She didn't pause. "Which part?" "Your follow-through. You're cutting short. You lose maybe 1/10 of efficiency." She processed this. "Show me." He stared at her like she'd surprised him, which she had, she suspected. He seemed to have been prepared for her to argue. He took the scythe, demonstrated the motion, the extension at the end, the particular follow-through that got the last few inches of each stroke. She watched his body, not just his hands. Then she took it back and tried it. Better. Noticeably better. "Right," she said. "Thank you." Bird stood there for a second, holding his own opinion about this situation, and then moved on without another word. She caught, at the edge of her vision, Ramos watching from further down the row with an expression of quiet amusement. The afternoons became their own kind of territory. She would hand off the kitchen to Eli, who had taken on the afternoon prep work with the solemn competence of a child with something to prove, and go out to the field with the scythe and work until she could see it was time to get back for supper. Her body adapted faster than she expected, which she credited to the month of heavy kitchen labor that had preceded this. She was tired in the evenings in a way that went all the way down to bone, the kind of tired that meant she fell asleep quickly and slept hard and didn't dream anything she remembered. Cole watched her work once. She saw him at the edge of the field, a distance away, standing still for maybe 5 minutes before he moved on. He didn't say anything about it that evening, neither did she. What changed was harder to define than just the labor. Something shifted in the bunkhouse. Not the first day, not even the second, but by the third day she noticed it in small things. The men filing in for supper and thanking her, not perfunctorily but actually. Hicks holding the door. Teague, his back still clearly hurting, taking the heavy water barrels from her hands without being asked. Bird, who had tested her since day one, stopping by the kitchen one morning with a look on his face like he was doing something against his better judgment, setting down a wrapped bundle of something on the counter and saying only, "Elk jerky, extra protein," for working that section. She looked at the jerky. She looked at Bird. He was already leaving. "Thank you, Bird," she said. "Don't mention it," he said, and meant it literally. Duff came back on Thursday. He didn't come with any announcement this time, just appeared on the South Road late in the afternoon, the black buggy moving at a pace that said he was not in a hurry because he believed the situation was already resolved in his favor. Clara saw him from the north field. She straightened up from the scythe, watched the buggy come down the lane, and stood there for a moment with her forearms resting on the handle and the cut wheat around her feet. Then she walked back toward the house. Cole was already in the yard when she arrived. Duff had stopped the buggy and gotten down, and he was looking at the fields with the same proprietary attention as last time. But something in his face was different this time. Something had shifted, she thought, in his estimate of where things stood. "You've made progress," he said to Cole. It wasn't a compliment. It was more like a revised calculation being stated aloud. "We have," Cole said. Duff looked at Clara, taking in the dungarees, the work gloves, the scythe she'd propped against the fence. Whatever he had expected to find at Redstone Ranch when he came back, this wasn't it. She could see him revising something, his story of how this went, the clean arc of it, the foregone conclusion. "How much is left?" he asked. "Enough," Cole said. Duff turned fully to face him. "I'll need an actual number, Mercer. Before the note date, I'm entitled to Northfield, Southwest, and Northwest sections," Clara said. Both men looked at her. "Plus the eastern strip along the creek. That's what's left. 4 days of cutting at current pace gets it done." She said it the way she said everything, directly, with the numbers behind it. Not as argument, but as fact. "The storm's tracking 2 days slower than Dutch's original estimate. We have room." Duff looked at her with an expression she'd seen before in other forms, on other faces. The particular look of a man recalculating what a woman in working clothes in a wheat field is, and what that means for the plan he walked in with. "You're the cook," he said. "I'm the cook," she agreed, "and I've been in that north field since Tuesday, so I know what's left and how fast it's going." A pause. The yard was quiet except for the distant sound of the reaper. "Your chain drive's repaired," Duff said, his eyes moving to the equipment shed. "That was a risk." "It held," she said. He looked at Cole. "If you don't make the note date—" "We'll make it," Cole said. "If you don't—" "We'll make it." Quieter this time. Not louder. Not a threat. Just a fact being placed in the space where Duff's doubt was trying to take root. Duff looked at them both. Cole's flat certainty, Clara's steadiness beside him, the cut wheat in the fields behind them. The sound of men still working through the afternoon was going late. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Then he straightened, adjusting his jacket, and walked back to the buggy. "Note date is the 22nd, he said, climbing up. "Not the 23rd. "I know when it is," Cole said. The buggy went back down the lane. Cole stood where he was until it was out of sight. Then he looked sideways at Clara, at the gloves, the dungarees, the fence where she'd propped the scythe. 4 days, he said. 4 days? She confirmed. And the storm? She had checked Dutch's weather read that morning. She'd checked it again at noon. The calculation sat in her head with the cold precision of things she could neither change nor ignore. Dutch thinks we have 5 days before it gets serious, she said. Maybe 6 if the track shifts north. A margin, not a comfortable one, not the kind you could relax inside of. Then we don't stop, Cole said. No, she said. We don't stop. She picked up the scythe from the fence. The afternoon light was going long and amber over the north field, the remaining wheat standing in it like something that didn't know yet what the next 4 days were going to ask of it. She went back. Dutch's revised estimate held for exactly 2 days. On the third morning after Duff's second visit, Clara woke at 4 as usual and knew before she reached the window that something had changed. The air had a different quality. Not colder, exactly, but denser, the kind of air that presses against the skin and makes the lungs work slightly harder. A barometric shift that she'd felt before in Pennsylvania when she was young, standing in a farmyard watching her father's face go still as he looked at the horizon. She dressed fast and went outside. Dutch was already in the yard, standing at the fence, looking southwest. He hadn't brought his coffee. When Dutch forgot his coffee, the thing he was looking at was serious. It moved, she said. Picked up speed overnight. He didn't look at her. That line of cloud, see how low it's sitting? That's not 2 days out anymore. How long do we have? He was quiet for a moment. A man who took his time with bad news because saying it wrong cost you more than saying it slow. Tonight, he said. Maybe tomorrow morning if we're lucky. But I wouldn't plan on lucky. She stood there with him in the pre-dawn dark, looking at the southwest sky, and did the arithmetic she didn't want to do. 1 full day of harvest left, by her count from yesterday. The eastern creek strip and the last section of the northwest corner. In normal conditions, with the crew they had, it would take through tomorrow afternoon. They didn't have tomorrow afternoon. I'll wake Cole, she said. I already did. He's in the barn. She found him there, in the lantern light, standing with Ramos and looking at a rough sketch of the remaining fields that Ramos had drawn in pencil on a feed sack. They both looked up when she came in. Dutch told you, Cole said. Yes. We're short. He said it plainly, the way he always said the hard things. No preamble, no softening, just the fact. Half a day of work at minimum, probably more. We can't do it in daylight hours. Then we work at night, Clara said. The 2 men looked at her. Lanterns, she said. On poles, on the wagon, carried by men at the row ends. It's been done. My father did it twice that I remember, when rain was coming and he didn't have a choice. She looked at the feed sack map, at the remaining sections. We can't cut everything, but we can cut the most valuable sections. The Northfield wheat is the thicker grade. It'll bring the better price. If we get that in, plus the eastern strip, we cover the note. Ramos studied the map. Working by lantern's slow, and it's hard on people who've already been going 14 hours. I know, she said. What's the alternative? He didn't have one. Cole looked at the map for another long moment, and she could see him running through it the way he ran through everything. Finding the edges, looking for the grip. There wasn't a comfortable way to hold this problem. There was only the thing they had to do. We'll need every man, he said, and every lantern on the property. I'll count them after breakfast, she said, and I'll cook something that'll carry biscuits, jerky, the last of the dried apple. Food people can eat standing up in a field. Cole nodded. He was already thinking past this conversation into the logistics of the night ahead. She watched his face and thought, not for the first time, that he carried an enormous amount without letting it show, and that this quality, which in another person might have looked like coldness, was actually something more like the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. Thank you, he said. Just that. Don't thank me yet, she said. We've still got to do it. The day was the hardest of all of them. She cooked through the morning with one eye on the sky, which was changing as she watched it. The cloud line thickening, the light taking on the flat, directionless quality that preceded serious weather. She made double quantities of everything portable. She recruited Eli to wrap biscuits in cloth and pack them in the supply baskets, and he did it with the focused efficiency he brought to all kitchen tasks now, without being asked twice about anything. It's going to be bad tonight, Eli said, not as a question. The weather will be bad, she said. We're going to be fine. He looked at her in the way he had, that direct, assessing look that saw more than it let on. You actually believe that? I do. How? She thought about it honestly, because he deserved honest answers. Because I've seen what these men can do when they have to, and because the numbers aren't impossible. They're just uncomfortable. Eli considered this. Dutch said the storm could be real bad. He said the word violent, and Dutch doesn't use big words unless he means them. Dutch is right about the storm. He's one of the best weather readers I've ever seen. She handed him another cloth for wrapping. But right about the storm and right about us failing aren't the same thing. He wrapped the biscuits. She watched him, this 9-year-old boy who had lost everything that was supposed to be permanent in his life and had learned, through no fault of his own, that the world did not guarantee shelter. She thought about what it meant for a child like that to be on a ranch that might not exist in 2 weeks, might belong to a man like Duff by the time the leaves finished falling. She went back to the stove. She worked faster. They went out at dusk. Cole had organized the lanterns, 11 of them, distributed across the crew, some on poles lashed to the wagon, some carried by hand. One large one hung at the field's edge as a fixed reference point. The effect, when you stood back and looked at the north field with the lanterns moving through the wheat, was strange and a little otherworldly. The light catching the grain in patches, moving shadows everywhere. The men becoming silhouettes inside their own small circles of yellow light. Clara was in the field 10 minutes after everyone else, having handed the kitchen to Eli with strict instructions and taken up her scythe. Her shoulder was worse today than it had been. She'd known it would be, the accumulated damage of a week of unaccustomed work making itself felt. But the pain was a manageable thing when she didn't think about it directly, the way a sound becomes easier to ignore once you stop listening for it. The wind came up around 9 o'clock. Not the storm itself, not yet, but the leading edge of it. A sustained, muscular wind from the southwest that bent the remaining wheat and made the lanterns jump on their poles and required everyone to lean slightly into it to maintain their footing. She felt it against her face, this wind, and understood what Dutch had been saying about it for 2 weeks, why he'd checked the sky 12 times a day, why he'd had the particular look of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the result of. The men didn't stop. She watched them, and they didn't stop. Hicks, with his red face gone gray with exhaustion, still cutting. Ramos, his voice hoarse from a week of shouting over machinery, moving the wagon with the focused precision of someone running on something past ordinary stamina. Sven, whose enormous physical capacity she had marveled at since the first day, slower now but still steady. Even Bird, who she had spent weeks trying to read, was out there in the dark with a lantern tied to his belt and a scythe in his hands, working a section that nobody had assigned him because he'd seen it needed doing. At 10:30, the first real gust came through. A wall of wind, a different order of magnitude from what had been blowing before, and with it the first scattering of rain. Not heavy yet, but definitive, the kind of rain that is announcing what's behind it. 3 lanterns went out. Someone swore. The wagon shifted on its wheels and required 2 men to hold it. Clara was in the northwest corner when she heard Eli. She almost missed it. The wind was loud now and getting louder, and the shout was small, high, the particular pitch of a child's voice under genuine fear. She turned around, looking into the dark beyond her lantern's reach, trying to locate the sound. Then she saw him. He was at the field's eastern edge, 60 yards from the nearest man, standing near the line of cottonwoods that ran along the fence. She couldn't see what he was doing there. He was supposed to be in the house. She had told him to stay in the house. And she started moving toward him, fast, already calling his name. The cottonwood came down without much warning. There was a sound, a crack, then a longer tearing, the particular complaint of a root system giving up. And then the tree was falling toward the fence, toward the small figure standing near it, and Clara was running. She wasn't going to make it. That was the thought she didn't let herself finish, the arithmetic she didn't let herself complete, because there was no useful action on the other side of it. She ran and she shouted his name, and Eli, to his credit, moved, stumbled sideways, trying to get clear. But he was 9, and the tree was fast and the ground was uneven in the dark. She hit him at a low angle, driving her shoulder into him, carrying them both sideways and down into the cut wheat, and the upper branches of the cottonwood came down across her left leg with a weight that was brief and enormous and left her ears ringing. They lay in the wheat for a moment, both of them breathing hard. "Eli," she said, "are you hurt?" "No." His voice was shaking. "Are you?" She pushed herself up on one arm and took stock. Her left leg was under two of the smaller branches, which she could move, and the larger branch had caught her calf rather than her knee, which was better. It hurt in the blunt, absolute way of things that are going to hurt more later. She moved the branches, got her leg free, put weight on it. It held. Not comfortably, but it held. "What are you doing out here?" she said, and her voice came out sharper than she meant it to, the fear of the last 30 seconds bleeding into the words. "I wanted to help," he said, in the voice of a child who knew he'd made a mistake, but had meant well enough that he expected partial credit. "I was going to carry a lantern for the east section." "I told you to stay in the house." "I know." He looked at her leg, at the scratch on her forearm from the branches. His face was pale in the lantern light, not just from fear, but from something that looked like genuine remorse. "I'm sorry. I didn't think—" "You didn't think," she agreed. "We'll talk about that later." She put her hand on his shoulder, briefly, firmly. "Are you hurt anywhere? Tell me the truth." "My hand. A little." He showed her. A scrape across the palm. Not serious. "That's all." Cole arrived at a run 40 seconds later, Dutch right behind him. They'd seen the tree come down, heard her shout. Cole reached them and stopped, looking at Clara, at Eli, at the tree on the ground. "He's all right," Clara said before Cole could ask. Cole crouched down to Eli's level and looked him over with the thoroughness of a man who doesn't trust quick assessments. "You sure?" "Scraped hand," Eli said. "She got me out of the way." Cole looked up at Clara. She was standing on the leg, which was protesting loudly but cooperating. "Your leg," he said. "It's fine." "You're favoring it." "It'll be fine." She picked up her scythe from where she'd dropped it. "He needs to go back to the house." "I want to—" "Eli." Cole's voice was quiet but unambiguous. "Inside. Now." Eli went. He took his lantern and walked back across the field toward the house with the gait of someone accepting a consequence they knew they'd earned. Clara watched him go, and the fear that had been a physical sensation in her chest for the last 2 minutes began, slowly, to loosen. "You all right?" Cole said. "Yes." She looked at the remaining field. The wind was worse now, the rain heavier, the lantern struggling. "We need to keep moving." "Clara." She'd stopped using Miss Whitmore somewhere around the second week, or he had, she wasn't entirely sure when it changed. "You just got hit by a tree. A branch, and we need to keep moving." He looked at her for a long moment in the wind and the rain and the jumping lantern light. Something moved across his face that she didn't have words for. Not admiration exactly, though there was some of that, something more complicated, something that had been building for 3 weeks and hadn't figured out yet what shape it wanted to take. "Stay off the leg if it gets worse," he said. "I know." They went back to the field. By midnight, the storm was fully present. The rain was coming sideways, driven by the wind into faces and hands, soaking through coats and reducing visibility to the edge of each lantern's range. The remaining wheat was flattening in the gusts, which paradoxically made it faster to cut in some sections and impossible in others where it had gone fully to ground. They cut what they could reach. At 1 a.m, Hicks sat down in the field and didn't get up on his own. Not collapse, not injury, just the complete expenditure of everything he had. Ramos and Sven got him to the barn, and he sat against the wall with a blanket and a cup of cold coffee and watched the lanterns through the open barn door. At 2, the reaper's repaired chain finally gave. The improvised repair had held through 4 days of harder use than she'd designed it for, and its failure wasn't a surprise, but the timing was brutal. They were 40 minutes from finishing the northwest corner, and the manual cutting without it would take significantly longer. Clara heard the machine stop. She looked at Cole across the field. He looked back at her. "How much?" he said. She knew what he was asking. Not the field, but the total, the harvest, the number against the note. She'd been running the calculation in her head all night, updating it with each pass of the scythe, each load taken from the field. "I don't know yet," she said. "Honestly, it depends on how much we can still get in." He nodded. He picked up a scythe himself. She watched him start cutting. This man who owned the ranch and had been managing the field operations and who hadn't slept more than 5 hours in the last 3 days. Cutting wheat by hand in the rain at 2 in the morning with the same focused persistence he brought to everything, without drama, without complaint, just the work and the wind and the rain. She reached into her coat pocket. $11.40. The same amount she'd arrived with because she'd put every dollar of her first month's pay back in the kitchen fund to cover the supply overrun she hadn't wanted to mention to Cole. She'd planned to tell him eventually. She'd been waiting for the right moment. She found him between the rows during a pause in the gusting and held out the coins and the folded bills. He looked at her hand. "What is this?" "It's what I have. It's not much, but if we come up short on the note and there's a gap I can close." "Clara," he said it quietly, in a voice that had stopped in it. "I know it's not enough on its own, but it's everything I have, and I'd rather you had it than, you can't give me your—" He stopped, started again. "This is your money." "I know what it is." She kept her hand out. The rain was running off her hat brim between them. "The ranch comes up short. Duff takes it. Eli has nowhere. You have nothing. Everything these men worked for means nothing." She looked at him steadily. "Take it, Cole." He looked at the money in her hand. He looked at her face. He didn't take the money, and he didn't refuse it. He just stood there in the rain for a moment with the expression of a man trying to identify what exactly has happened to him and when. "I'll pay you back," he said finally. "I know you will." He took the money. He folded it into his shirt pocket without looking at it again and went back to the wheat. She picked up her scythe and followed him. They cut until the storm made it impossible, until the rain was too heavy and the wind too violent and the lanterns were going out one by one, until even the strongest men were moving more by feel than by sight, until Ramos finally came to Cole at 3:30 and said simply, "That's all we can do tonight." Cole stood still in the ruined field, in the rain, and looked at what was left standing. Clara stood beside him. "Is it enough?" he said. Not to her specifically, just to the rain, to the dark, to the arithmetic of the situation. She didn't know. She was honest enough not to pretend she did. The number they needed and the number they had were close enough that she couldn't be certain, not in the dark and the rain with the storm pressing down on everything, which numbers were which. "We'll count it in the morning," she said. He nodded. They walked back to the house together, side by side in the dark, the storm loud around them, and she was aware that something had changed between this man and her. Not declared, not resolved, just shifted, the way a door shifts on its hinges when the frame settles. Changed in the wheat field under the lanterns, changed when she held out her $11.40 in the rain, changed in all the accumulated weight of 23 days on a ranch that had become, somewhere in the middle of all this work and exhaustion and difficulty, the place she thought of when she thought of where she was. The morning after the storm was the kind of quiet that follows violence. Not peaceful, exactly, but emptied out, the way a room feels after everyone has left it. Clara woke at 6, which was the latest she'd slept since arriving at Redstone Ranch, and lay still for a moment listening to the absence of wind. Her left leg had stiffened overnight into something that required negotiation before it would bear weight. She sat on the edge of the bed and worked the joint slowly, talking it back into usefulness, and thought about the numbers she hadn't been able to confirm in the dark, in the rain. She got up. She went to the window. The fields looked flattened and exhausted, the way the men had looked coming in at 3:30. Sections of the unharvested wheat were beaten down, some of it unsalvageable. The cottonwood along the fence line was still lying where it had fallen. The yard was littered with small debris, branches, a feed bucket, one of the lantern poles snapped off at the base. Cole was already outside. She could see him from the window, standing at the edge of the north field, looking at what the storm had left. His posture told her everything about the state of the count before she'd done any arithmetic herself. She dressed and went down. He heard her coming across the yard and turned. He looked like a man who had slept 3 hours in his clothes, because that was exactly what he was. "Tell me," she said. "I walked it at first light." He turned back to the field. We're short. Not by much, but we're short. She had known it was possible. She'd done the calculation enough times that the possibility lived in her head as a familiar shape. Knowing a thing was possible, she discovered, did not make hearing it confirmed any easier. How much? Enough that Duff can call the note? Not enough that anyone reasonable looking at the situation would think it was fair. He said this without bitterness, just precision. But Duff's not in the business of reasonable. She stood beside him and looked at the field and let herself feel the full weight of it for a moment. The weeks of work, the men's exhaustion, the repaired chain and the water barrels, and the 300 small problems solved and the one large one that had not been. Her $11.40 folded into his shirt pocket in the rain. There was a particular kind of failure that isn't your fault and isn't fair and is still completely real. She'd met it before. She knew its face. But she also knew something else, something she'd learned in the years between the Ohio bookkeeping job and the Harding Falls mercantile ledger, and every other place where someone had handed her a column of numbers and expected her to find nothing wrong with them. She knew that when something felt entirely settled, entirely predetermined, there was usually a reason the person who wanted it that way needed it to feel that way. I need to go to Mill Haven, she said. Cole looked at her. Today's Saturday. The note's due Tuesday. I know when it's due. She turned from the field. I need to look at something, the original loan documents. Do you have copies here? In the study. What are you? Get them out, she said. I want to go through them before I leave. He spread the papers on the kitchen table while she made coffee, because the morning required coffee before anything else was possible, and she went through the loan documents the way she'd learned to go through ledgers, methodically, without assumption, not looking for anything specific, but open to finding something wrong. The note itself, the terms, the interest calculations, the amendment from 2 years ago that Cole mentioned almost in passing, the one where Duff had offered to restructure the payment schedule when the previous harvest came up lean. She stopped at the amendment. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, more slowly, with the particular attention she gave to language that was trying to appear straightforward. Cole, she said, when Duff restructured this 2 years ago, did you have a lawyer look at the new terms? He was at the stove pouring his coffee. He paused. No, the county lawyer was in Mill Haven, and I needed it signed that week. Duff said the terms were the same, just the schedule moved. The terms are not the same. He set the coffee pot down and came to the table. She pointed to the clause, a dense paragraph in the middle of the amendment, written in the kind of language that hid its meaning in plain sight, the legal equivalent of speaking loudly about nothing important while doing something quiet in the corner. The original note, she said, calculated interest on the outstanding principal only. Standard. This amendment changed it, here, in this language, to compound the interest quarterly on the full original loan amount, not the reduced balance, which means you've been paying more interest than you should have been for 2 years, applied against a principal that should have been lower than the one Duff's been charging you against. She looked up at him. The number you're short by this harvest, I'd want a lawyer to confirm it, but I think a correct calculation of what you actually owe under the original terms is less than what Duff says you owe, possibly significantly less. Cole stared at the paper. She watched him read the clause she'd pointed to, then read it again. He changed the terms, Cole said. He wrote language that let him claim the terms were the same while changing the calculation underneath. She straightened up. It may be an error. It may be deliberate. Either way, a lawyer needs to look at this today, and that lawyer needs to be in Mill Haven before the county office closes. Cole was very still. She recognized the stillness, the one from the first day in the yard when he'd assessed her, the one from the study when he'd looked at her kitchen arithmetic. The stillness of a man getting past the thing he's feeling so he can think clearly. Go, he said. I'll take Dutch. I'll be back by... Take my horse, faster. He was already moving toward the door. I'll saddle him. Clara? He stopped. If this is what you think it is, let me confirm it first, she said. Don't let yourself believe it until I come back with someone who can make it mean something. He held her gaze for one moment. All right. She took his horse, and she rode to Mill Haven. The county lawyer was a man named Aldous Price, who practiced out of a narrow office on Millhaven's Main Street and had the slightly rumpled, perpetually tired look of a man who handled too many cases in too little space. He was 60-something, slow-moving, and had eyes that became significantly less slow when Clara spread the loan documents on his desk and showed him the amendment clause. He read it. He read it again. He asked her 2 questions. He went to his bookshelf and pulled a reference volume and read a passage from it, and then set the book down carefully, the way you set a thing down when you want to be sure you're not about to drop it. "How long have you known Cole Mercer?" he asked. 3 weeks, she said. He looked at her over his glasses. "And you found this?" "I've been a bookkeeper. I know what numbers look like when they've been adjusted to produce a particular outcome." Price was quiet for a moment, looking at the documents. Outside his window, Millhaven went about its Saturday business. Wagons on the street, voices, the ordinary movement of a town that didn't know anything particular was happening. "This clause," he said, "is not ambiguous in what it does. It is, however, written to appear ambiguous, which suggests intention rather than error." He paused. "I'll need to verify the calculations, and I'll need Mercer here to authorize me to act. But Miss Whitmore, if your arithmetic is correct, and from what I can see I believe it is, Mercer has been overcharged a substantial amount over 2 years. The note balance is lower than Duff has represented it to be, and the harvest shortfall may not constitute a default at all under the original terms." Clara let out a breath she'd been holding since she sat down. "Can you be at the county courthouse Tuesday morning?" she asked. "I'll be there Monday evening," Price said. "I have some paperwork to prepare." She rode back fast. Cole was in the yard when she came through the gate, and he read her face before she could say a word. Not because it was written there obviously, but because he'd gotten good at reading her face over 3 weeks, better than she'd entirely realized. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She gave him the facts in the order they mattered, concisely, the way she gave him everything. "Here is what I found, here is what it means, here is what we need to do next." His expression went through several things while she talked. Anger, which he controlled. Something that looked like relief but was more complicated. The feeling not of a problem solved, but of a reality finally confirmed that had been wrong for 2 years and he hadn't known. "I should have had a lawyer," he said. It came out quiet, without self-pity. "Just an accounting." "You trusted someone who was in a position to be trusted," she said. "That's not stupidity. It's what being deceived looks like from the inside." He looked at her. "Price needs you in Millhaven Monday to sign authorization papers," she said. "I'll drive with you." "Clara." He said her name and then seemed to need a moment after that. "You've been here 3 weeks. 24 days, she said. 24 days, and you've... He stopped, tried again. "I don't know how to say this correctly, but what you've done for this ranch at Cole." She said his name the way he'd said hers, with the particular weight of people who have spent enough time in a hard situation together that the name means something it didn't mean before. "Save it for after Tuesday. Right now let's go tell Dutch to get the wagon ready." He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him come to it in several days. "Right. Well, the Fuller County Courthouse was a brick building on Millhaven's east end that smelled of old paper and floor wax and the specific staleness of rooms where important things happened to ordinary people. Harlan Duff was already there when Clara and Cole arrived Monday morning, which meant he'd had his own information about Price's filing and had come prepared. He had a lawyer with him, a younger man, well-dressed, from the county seat, and the proprietary calm of a man who believes the proceeding is a formality. That belief began to erode approximately 20 minutes into the hearing. Price was methodical in the way that proved most damaging to Duff's position. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just precise. He laid out the original note terms. He laid out the amendment. He showed the calculation as written and the calculation as it should have been under the original agreement. He had a second lawyer from Millhaven, a woman named Carver, who specialized in contract disputes, who Price had called in as a second opinion, confirm his reading of the clause. Duff's lawyer objected, repeatedly, in ways that became progressively less confident as the morning went on. The circuit judge, a heavy-set man named Harrington, who had the expression of someone who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them, listened to each objection, and overruled most of them with the brevity of a man who has already formed an opinion and is waiting for the other side to stop talking. Clara sat beside Cole and watched. She was not, she wanted to be clear to herself, operating under any illusion that this was clean or satisfying in the way that stories sometimes made these moments seem. There was nothing triumphant about watching a man's scheme dismantled in a county courthouse. Duff sat at his table with his jaw set and his hands flat on the table, and whatever he was feeling, he kept it off his face, and she thought that this was a man who had done this kind of thing before and would likely do it again in some other form to some other family. The legal system had caught him this time. That was real. It wasn't the same as justice being permanent or corruption being finished, but it was something. Judge Harrington called his ruling at 11:15. The amendment clause, as written, constituted a material misrepresentation of the loan terms. The interest calculations for the prior 2 years would be recalculated under the original note terms. The adjusted balance was lower than the harvest proceeds Cole had already confirmed that morning. Redstone Ranch was not in default. The foreclosure proceeding was voided. Duff stood when the ruling was read. He looked at Cole for a moment. He looked at Clara for slightly longer. Then he picked up his hat and left the room without speaking. His lawyer gathered the papers with the careful, unhurried movements of a professional who has lost before and knows how to do it without making it worse. He glanced at Price and at Clara on the way out. Something in his expression, brief, there and gone, looked almost like acknowledgement. Cole sat very still after the room had cleared. "It's done," Price said, gathering his own papers. "I'll file the documentation this afternoon. You'll want to keep copies of everything, Mercer. All of it. Duff is not a man who accepts outcomes gracefully." "I know what he is," Cole said. "Yes." Price looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore, it was a pleasure. You have a talent for finding the thing that's been hidden in plain sight." "Thank you for moving quickly," she said. He nodded and left. They were alone in the room then, Cole and Clara, in the quiet after everything. Cole looked at the table. He looked at his hands. She waited, because she'd learned that he needed a moment after large things to find where he was. "My father borrowed from Duff because he had no other option," he said. "And Duff has been holding this land in his mind since before I took it over. 20 years of patience." He paused. "And it took someone being here for 24 days to find what was wrong." 24 days, she said, "and the rest of it was already there. The work your men did, the harvest, the ranch that was worth fighting for." She looked at him steadily. "I found a clause in a document. That's not what saved Redstone." He looked at her. "You're going to make me say it." "Say what?" "That it wasn't just the clause." He met her eyes. "That it was all of it. The kitchen and the supplies and the field and the chain and the storm and you standing in the rain handing me your last dollar." She felt something shift in her chest. $11.40, she said. "I'm going to pay you back." "I know you are." He was quiet for another moment. Outside the courthouse windows, Millhaven went about its business. A wagon. Voices. The ordinary sounds of a town that didn't know what had just happened in this room, which was fine. Most important things happen without an audience. "I want to ask you something," Cole said. "All right." "When I wrote that letter, the original letter, the one Mrs. Paulson gave you, I wrote it the way I write everything, direct, not particularly warm." He paused. "I want to know what made you write back." She thought about it. She thought about the morning she'd received the letter, sitting at the desk in her room at Mrs. Paulson's boarding house, with Harding Falls going about its business outside the window and $11.40 to her name. She thought about what she'd seen in his blunt, cramped handwriting. Not warmth, not promise, just honesty. "If this suits you. If it doesn't, don't bother." "You didn't pretend it was something it wasn't," she said. "You said it was hard and the men weren't easy and the place was far from town. You didn't try to make it sound better than it was to get me to come." She paused. "I'd spent 8 months in a place where everyone was very careful about how things sounded. I was tired of that." He looked at her for a long time. "Stay," he said. She waited. "Not as the cook, you can cook if you want to, but that's not what I'm asking." He was doing the thing where he was finding the words one at a time,
which was not his natural mode, and she found that she appreciated his difficulty with it. The ranch, the accounts, everything you've built here in 24 days, stay and build the rest of it. As a partner. He stopped. I'm not saying this well. You're saying it fine, she said. I'm saying it like a man who hasn't said anything like it before and isn't sure of the ground. That's how it sounded, she agreed. I understood it. He looked at her. And? She thought about Harding Falls, the yellow-green sky, Dorothy Alcott's voice carrying on the platform. She thought about the train pulling out and the big sky opening up and the wagon ride with Dutch, and Eli at the kitchen door asking if there was pie left.
She thought about the north field in the lantern light, and Bird's elk jerky left on the counter, and Ramos nodding at the end of a hard day, and Hicks holding a door. She thought about the feeling, which she'd been too busy to examine directly until now, of waking up each morning in a place where the work she did was necessary and seen and real, where she wasn't too much or too direct or too capable of finding what was wrong with the numbers, where she was just, simply, what was needed. The truth about belonging, and she had lived long enough without it to understand this in a way she couldn't have at 20, is that it doesn't feel the way you expect it to. It doesn't arrive with ceremony. It builds the way a repair holds, the way a chain survives a harvest season. Not perfectly, not without improvisation, but thoroughly enough that it doesn't give out when you need it most. You look up one day, in the middle of something hard, and you realize, this is where I am. This is where I was going. Yes, she said. Cole nodded. He didn't smile extravagantly or reach for her hand or make the moment into something it needed embellishment to be. He just nodded, the way he confirmed things that were settled, and she thought that this plain, unhurried acknowledgement was exactly the right response, and she wouldn't have wanted another kind. We should get back, he said. Dutch will have questions about the ruling, and Eli's been waiting since this morning to find out what happened. He'll want pie, she said. He always wants pie. They walked out of the courthouse into the Millhaven morning, and she noticed, the way she noticed things, quietly, without making a production of it, that he walked beside her rather than ahead of her, which was not something that every man would have done without thinking about it, and which she took note of and filed away with all the other things she'd been noticing about Cole Mercer over 24 days. The harvest season ended the way hard things end, not with a clean conclusion, but with a gradual easing, the pressure releasing day by day until one morning you realize it's gone. The wheat was in. The note was paid, recalculated under terms that turned out to leave Cole with money he hadn't expected to have, which he used for a new reaper chain in the water barrel that had needed replacing since August, and 3 months of wages paid ahead for every man on the ranch. Hicks cried a little when Cole told him about the wages, which he denied afterward, and nobody pressed him on it. Duff did not come back. Price had warned them he might try something in another form, and Clara kept copies of every document in a locked box in the study, which she'd taken over as a shared workspace by mutual, unspoken agreement. She wasn't naive enough to think a man like Duff simply went away. She was clear-eyed enough to know that vigilance and fear were different things, and that only one of them was useful. The town of Millhaven, which had never particularly noticed Clara Whitmore on the supply trips she'd made through harvest season, became gradually aware of her after the courthouse ruling. The story traveled the way stories do in small towns, imperfectly, with additions and subtractions, but with the essential shape intact. The woman who found the claws, the cook who cut wheat, the newcomer who held the line when everyone else was calculating the odds. Mrs. Farber at the Millhaven dry goods store, who had looked through Clara on her first supply visit, found occasion to compliment her judgment the next time she came in. The town banker, a different man from Duff's associate in Fuller County, made a point of introducing himself. Small recognitions, small adjustments. The kind of thing that doesn't feel like much until you've spent enough time without it to know what the absence weighs. She didn't need it exactly, but she wasn't indifferent to it either because she was human, and humans are not built to be entirely indifferent to being seen correctly. Eli, for his part, took the resolution of things with the practical equanimity of a child who had decided early in the process that things were going to work out and was therefore not particularly surprised when they did. He did accept his consequence for leaving the house during the storm without complaint. A week of extra kitchen duties and an honest conversation with Clara about the difference between wanting to help and making yourself into another problem for someone else to solve. "I understand it," he told her when they'd talked it through. "I just didn't think about it that way at the time." "That's what consequences are for," she said. "So you think about it that way next time." He nodded. Then, "I'm glad you pushed me out of the way. I'm glad I got there in time," she said. He looked at her with that old, assessing look. "Are you staying?" "I'm staying." He absorbed this. "Cole asked you?" "He did." "What did you say?" "I said yes." Eli nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. "I told Dutch you would," he said. "Back in the second week, I said you had the look of someone who'd found the place they were looking for and didn't know it yet." She looked at him. "You're 9 years old." "I know," he said, and went back to peeling potatoes. She stood in the kitchen, her kitchen, as she'd come to think of it, with all the discomfort and familiarity that word carried, and listened to the sound of Eli at the table and the ranch outside the window, and the wind moving through the cottonwoods along the fence, the ones that were still standing and the one that wasn't. The difficult roads, she thought, the ones you walk because there's no other option, or because you've been pushed, or because you've run out of everywhere else. People talk about those roads as if they're detours from the life you were supposed to have, the tolerable detours between the good parts. She used to think that too. But sometimes a difficult road isn't taking you away from something. Sometimes it's just the only route to where you were going all along, and you couldn't have known that from the starting point, and the knowing of it only comes at the end, standing in someone else's kitchen that has become your own, with the smell of coffee and cut wheat and wood smoke, and the knowledge, not triumphant, not dramatic, just solid and true, that you are exactly where you belong. She put water on for coffee. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and she found, to her own quiet satisfaction, that this no longer felt like a burden. It felt like hers.